Chapter 7. A Letter. Rain was just beginning to fall in fat drops, pelting the outer ward, when Haille followed the rider through the inner gate to the castle courtyard. There the rider met with castle guards who sent a squire off to find the captain of the watch. The Carithian rider did not take a seat, nor did he move beneath the shelter of the guardhouse away from the coming rain. Instead he stared at his boots, which were covered in a shell of dried mud. He hooked his thumbs behind his belt and tapped his fingers on his wide silver buckle. He was a man in his 4th decade, still possessing the vigor of youth, but with a face lined by experience. His short, cropped hair was flecked with hints of gray, his skin worn dark by sun and wind. His brow was furrowed and his mouth bent in a frown as he waited. The captain of the watch appeared. As if he recognized some sign of rank or authority on the ranger that his subordinates had not, he made a deep bow and cast his eyes downward as he spoke some sort of apology, his hand to his chest. There was no wait after that. The captain walked with the visitor into the keep, and not long after, Haille saw squires and ladies-in-waiting moving at a clipped pace to find their masters and mistresses. Ill tidings, Haille thought. Haille's father, Yona, and other members of the Council of Elders met with the ranger late into the night, the meeting chamber sealed and candlelight flickering in the gap under the doors. Haille passed by a few times, but the look and rank of the guards on the outside told him nothing would persuade them to relocate down the hall so he could eavesdrop. Haille felt forgotten. Even the jays did not show at his window, kept away by the driving rain and early darkness. With nothing else to do, Haille finished the last of his lines at the desk in his room, ate dinner next to his brazier while studying the stolen folio pages, then prepared for bed. He was just getting under the covers when he heard footsteps in the hall. Eager for news and company, he leapt out at once, padded across the room, and flung open his door just in time to see his father and the ranger step into the study and close the door. Again, guards with grave expressions took up places outside, and Haille knew he would not be able to listen. Instead, he went back to his bed, lifted the covers, and fell into a fitful sleep. When he woke, it felt like it was after midnight. The rain had stopped, but he could still hear the rumble of distant thunder. By the darkness under his door, he knew the chambers to be closed for the night. The guards would be stationed at the outside doors. His eyes, adjusted to the dark, detected a faint flicker, an orange aura gleaming off the stone floor. The candles in the hall were snuffed out, but he guessed that the light was coming from his father's study. He slipped out of bed, crossed the room, and opened his chamber door. Sure enough, the door to the study was still ajar. The corridor was silent of voices and empty of any servants or soldiers, so he made his way down the hall and peered into the room. It was weakly lit by a couple of guttering candles. 4 of 6 had flickered out on the candelabrum on the table in the center of the room. One candle, standing crooked in a candlestick, was dripping into a molten pool that threatened to spill over onto the maps that lay spread on the table. The seat where the ranger had sat was still depressed in the center from his weight, but there was no other sign of him. Haille's father was alone and asleep at his writing desk next to the window. A gust of wind had blown open the shutter so that Haille could see thunderheads pulsing with light in the distance. The letters his father had been writing had been blown to the floor. The king was leaning back, his arms at rest on the side of his chair, the quill still hanging loosely in his ink-stained fingers. He was in a finely woven tunic bearing the crossed sword and hammer of the Hillborn house over his heart. Haille unhooked his father's cloak from the back of the study door, removed the quill from his limp hand, and draped the cloak over his still body, drawing it all the way to his father's neck. Even in repose he looked the part of king with his rugged features, strong jaw, and wide masculine brow. His nose was well proportioned if slightly crooked from an injury sustained in the practice ring when young. His hair was dark and wavy with wisps of gray behind the ears and on his temples. Such noble features. Shame I have none of them. Haille took after his mother, at least that was what he was told. A bitter irony it was, since she was so loved and he was not. But what else could he expect as the defective child she had died giving birth to? His very face was a reminder of the benign, beautiful queen the people had lost. That King Talamar had lost too. Haille knew he was a constant reminder of the loss, which made him a bitter sight for his father's eyes. Some days Haille could read the pain and anguish in the king's face. Other times, like now, his father looked at peace. Handsome, but vulnerable. Noble, but helpless. Haille could not feel anything but love for him. Some days Haille's chest ached, his painful loneliness driving him to the window's edge. I could do him a favor by simply dying. But now he could do a favor for his father by picking up the papers that had scattered to the floor. He knelt, pulling the pages together. Here and there a stray raindrop had ridden the breeze through the window and landed on the fresh ink, blurring the occasional letter and disrupting the otherwise neatly printed words of his father's hand. The pages were letters written to lords throughout the realm, the wording similar in each, explaining that normally warring tribes from the eastern steppes had been united by a mysterious leader known only as the Magus. War bands had crossed the great river and overwhelmed villages in eastern Carith. Refugees were flooding west, pursued by war parties burning fields before they could be harvested. King Ian of Carith sought Antis's help, and all able-bodied men were called to supplement the kingdom's forces. King Talamar was riding south to serve aid to Carith. Haille swallowed the lump in his throat. He picked up more letters, each identical in its message, differing only by addressee. Lord Shelby of Terresthorpe, Lord Denison of Malrup, Lady Jude of Linwood, Lord Atworth of Cathill, Lord Wainwright of Red Ridge, Lady Annabeth of Kinth. The entire kingdom was being called to arms. A final page stood out to him, this one because the wording, the message, was different. He began to read. Lord Master Chambridge of Carazons, I write you in the midst of great turmoil with unrest in the south that requires us to marshal our forces. But a greater turmoil disturbs my heart and my mind. My son, as you know, suffers from an affliction that healers have been unable to treat for his entire life. He is shunned for it and developed a sullen and recalcitrant character as a result. And despite the best efforts of teachers and mentors of the highest rank and quality here in Antis, he continues to disappoint me. After much consideration, I have decided to ask if you would find space for him in your home. My hope is that around other children similarly afflicted and aggrieved he might find acceptance, solidarity, and build the character fitting for a young man of his station. Gracefully, Lord King Talamar. Haille had to stretch open his mouth to relieve the popping sensation he felt in his ears. His head was spinning. He was standing, his feet planted, yet it was as if the floor had collapsed. The ceiling crashed down, and he was tumbling, dizzy among shattered bricks, splinters, timbers, and flakes of mortar. His father took a deep breath in his sleep, yet Haille could not bring himself to look in his father's direction. His eyes fell on the map on the table, drawn to the distant corners of the kingdom and the wider realm. He had never been to Master Chambridge's home for the afflicted, but he had been to similar orphanages in the lower city, homes where unwanted, incurable children with misshapen heads, crossed eyes who could not speak or be toilet-trained, were sent to be treated. More like forgotten. Was he such a disappointment to his father and an embarrassment to the nobility? Yes, I am. The answer is in my father's own hand. The rest of the papers dropped from his fingers as he stumbled to the door like a drunken man lost in the streets of the night. The lower city closed in on Haille, the mud and timber construction replacing the stone masonry of the upper city. Here the homes, the stores, and the taverns were packed so close together that they threatened to teeter and lean into each other, ready to touch over the streets and alleyways. Haille was glad of it, for he could disappear into canyons of anonymity. The castle, its turrets, its flying banners, and all those signs of royalty, nobility, and the accompanying expectations of prestige were lost in the night mist and eclipsed by crooked walls of flaking brick. Like the buildings, the people were packed together, forced by the necessity of large families and small purses. The air was rank with the odor of chamber pots, kitchen scraps, and butcher's offal. He leapt gutters overflowing with grey wastewater and approached taverns, asking patrons if they knew where the Barnes family lived. Antis may have been a city, but the lower city was still a village where everyone knew one another. It did not take him long to find Caitlin's home, a cottage beyond the confines of the lower city, in an outer neighborhood, on a lane without a name shaded by cottonwood trees. There was only one window that faced the street. He was sure it opened to the main room where the children likely slept near the fireplace. He threw pebbles at the shutters until the latch on the other side clicked, and a sleepy-eyed girl, a year or two Caitlin's junior, peered out. "I am looking for Caitlin Barnes." The girl leaned away into the darkness. Haille thought she would close the shutters on him, but instead, after some rustling, Caitlin appeared at the window. "Haille, what are you doing here?" she whispered. She tried to push the other girl and now a younger boy away from the window, but they pressed their faces to the gap, trying to see the stranger. "Jessamy, Maxwell, go back to sleep." Neither listened, and they remained at the window with wide, candid eyes. Something about siblings, even adopted ones, sharing a room, even a bed together, struck Haille where he still felt weak and vulnerable. He had to fight a tightness in his throat before he spoke up. "I need your help." "My help? Can you come out and speak to me or not?" "Haille," she said, her tone matching his. "What time is it? How did you find me?" "The taverns are open late, and everyone knows each other in the lower city." "Haille, it's the middle of the night." "Caitlin, please," he said, louder than intended. Perhaps because his voice broke, she sensed his desperation. "Hold on." She pulled the shutters closed. No light appeared from within, but eventually the front door opened and she stepped out, trousers pulled up over her nightshirt. Haille reached into his pocket and unfolded the vellum pages from the library folio. "Is this authentic? Is what it says true?" he asked. "About the font of Jasmine?" "Yes." "Well, I don't know, Haille." "You said that some things in that section were real. How do you know?" "Haille, what is going on? Why are you dressed like that?" she said, rubbing the oily, tattered cloak he was wearing between her thumb and forefinger. "You look like a peasant." "I wanted to fit in. It was no use." The tears he had been holding in burst out, overcoming his embarrassment. Caitlin looked at him, her jaw slack, but she recovered herself and guided him to the far corner of the yard where they sat down on overturned washtubs. She went so far as to hold his hands in hers. The physical touch only broke down Haille's resolve further. Finally, after a time where neither said anything, he wiped his nose with his sleeve. He said, "My father wants to send me away. He is that disappointed in me." "Because of your condition?" He nodded, pulling at the bite palette that hung around his neck. "I'm too soft, too lacking in whatever he wants of me. I'm just not enough." "Haille, I'm sorry." "I have to get better. I have to fix myself." "Sometimes people outgrow the shaking sickness." "But they can't be sure. No, I need a cure." He wiped his nose again and snorted. "The font. Does it really grant the wish of children who have had maladies since birth?" She ran her right hand up her left arm and rubbed it. "Haille, I don't know for sure." "You said." "I know what I said." "You believe some of the superstitions are true." She continued to rub her arm. "Yes." "Then why are they hidden?" "Think about it, Haille. Hilary Hilborn didn't want people to use magic because it was foolish, but because it could be dangerous. To him, he was trying to secure power." Haille tilted his head back, his hand to his mouth. He let it slide down, pulling at his face. "Why didn't I think of that? That doesn't mean every wives' tale is true, mind you. Then why were you in there with all those books?" "I have my reasons," she said, putting her hands on her lap. Haille wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "The font is in Moorbright Mountain. I'm going to find it." "Haille, that is on the other side of the kingdom, on the edge of the realm." "My father will send me just as far, but in the opposite direction. This is my only chance." "Haille, it's dangerous. Have you given this any thought? You're wise not to dress richly, but do you have supplies, food, provisions, a rucksack even?" "I brought my sword." The whites of her eyes shone in the darkness as Caitlin rolled them. "Boys are stupid." "I'm not stupid. I brought money," he said, holding up a change purse heavy with gold capinhas. "Well, that's a start," she said, standing. "Wait here." Haille did as she said, holding his head against the palms of his hand, his elbows propped on his knees. He listened to the night sounds, crickets, a night lark cooing for its mate, the flutter of bats overhead. The sky had cleared and clouds of stars spread from one horizon to the next. Haille tried to lose himself in the sight, projecting his mind away from his betraying, disappointing body and into the unearthly, eternal vision before him. But each time he was on the edge of losing himself, those words of his father's flashed before his eyes as if written in the very stars themselves. "Continues to disappoint." The pinpoints of light blurred. He put his head back in his hands, this time beating on his skull with the meaty part of his fist. So lost he was in his own self-loathing, he did not even notice Caitlin return from the cottage until she reached out to still his hands. He looked up, startled. She was wearing a traveling tunic and a well-fitting cloak. Her hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail and a rucksack was slung on her shoulder. Another was hanging from her arm. She plopped it into Haille's lap. "Well, come on. Let's go," she said.